All right, welcome to another edition of the forecast contest. This is today's Feb 11th, and we're very pleased to have industry guests from Maxar here with us. I believe it's Bradley and Al on the line. For today, I think we're going to kind of, in terms of today's agenda, our plan is to start with attribution. So we'll look back at some of the previous forecasts and kind of talk about that, and then we'll shift into the current forecast, and then we'll leave time certainly, in particular for our industry guests to talk about any kind of specific events that they think are helpful, or if anyone else has any kind of interesting agenda items that they want to bring up in our remaining time. Before we dive into this and start with our attribution, does anyone have anything else they want to make sure we cover in today's call? No? Okay. All right. So let's start with attribution here. And again, I'm going to kind of kick us off here, but folks, just jump in here because I think there's well, we say this every week, but I think it's been a really interesting period here, and I'm sure in particular the guys from Maxar may have a lot to say about this. But looking at our verification, so this is our last verification period. This is Feb 5th, Feb 9th. This is forecasts that were issued on January 1st, and I'm going to sort here by the forecast HDDs, so highest on top and lowest on the bottom. So I guess a couple themes from this week. I was just talking about this with Zach offline, but the verification was on the warmer side. You can see the verification was 137 HDDs, but unlike the past couple of weeks, it wasn't as extreme. I think last week's verification was about 20 HDDs warmer than any of the forecasts. In this case, we actually had some folks here who did a really nice job, including our industry guest here at 132, which was really close. And Michael, who's on the line here too, also did really well. And then, some of our non-human inputs were sort of in the ballpark. I guess what also stands out here is the ECMWF on the wrong side of things. This has been the CFS and the ECMWF had, I think it's fair to say, I've had a tough time of it, in particular over the last 30 days or so. This was an interesting case. I remember I was talking a lot about this, where the CFS actually was not as cold. And I remember us talking about it even during the forecast around, in late January about it doesn't happen that often where the CFS is the colder model. And hey, maybe that meant something, right? Maybe it was significant or something like that. But I remember us talking about that. But regardless, again, this is the case where the ECMWF did not do well. One other thing I wanted to point out here was and I know Maxar also talked a lot about this in their report, which I'm sure they'll mention. But when you look at the bias, I'll show the 30-day bias and the heating season bias. So this is the 30-day bias. So you can see the number of forecasts here. It is a little bit abbreviated for the human forecast because, we took off around the holidays. But for the CFS, which includes 5 forecasts, that's not a great bias, over 40 HDDs. And the ECMWF also, not as bad, but almost a 30 HDD bias, which is a lot, and some of the human forecasters here, myself included, not much better, unfortunately. So that's the 30-day bias. And here's the heating season bias. So the heating season bias, we go back, October, forecast issued since October. So yeah, it's a long ways ago. Remember, we did have some cold, believe it or not, back in November. Seems like a long time ago. But here's the bias. I'll sort it again by bias. And definitely the complexion changes here a lot. And I think this is just worth mentioning. Well, let me say what the numbers are first. The CFS at 17, the EC at 7.6. So obviously not great, but, with the EC, if you take out probably, this includes the last 30 days, right? So I don't remember exactly, but I'm guessing if you took out the last 30 days, the ECMWF probably didn't have much of a bias at all, maybe even a negative bias before that point. And so I think that brings up an interesting point too, especially as when we talk about the forecast, which is, certainly there's been a tremendous bias in the last 30 days, but there wasn't necessarily, that kind of bias before that 30-day period, which brings up maybe a couple questions at least, which is one, why the bias over the last 30 days and not before then? And how stable is that bias? How reliable is it in terms of making a forecast? All right, I think I've talked long enough. I do want to look at some of the maps too. I'll utilize Maxar's Dynacast page also so that we can look at some of the maps. And actually, I'll even pull up, I think we have, this is Maxar's forecast from the 21st, just so you can see what the forecasts were. And I want to open it up now, but while I'm opening it up, I'm going to go to Dynacast and just pull up the verification for Feb 5th to Feb 9th. Anyone want to jump in? Here's the, should be loading here. Yeah, so here's the, here's our forecast. There's that 137 that we talked about. And here's how it looked from a temperature standpoint. So that's, again, that's the verification with our ridge in the southeast, or warmer than normal temperatures in the southeast, kind of a messy pattern up the middle, so to speak, with some cold, and then warmth again in the west. And again, let's again look at the forecast, or at least some of the forecast here. Again, we've got the Maxar forecast from that period. So this is not Monday morning quarterback, right? This is what they had. So definitely, indications to that ridge in the southeast. And actually, to give you guys to toot your horn a little bit here, you can see the CFS in particular it's not even like, I mean, CFS was showing an opposite pattern. I mean, let's just be honest, right? I mean, they actually had cool anomalies in the southeast United States, right? Actually suggesting that ridge was going to really break down, and the ECMWF wasn't much better. I mean, just very messy, right? Because we know there was actually warmth in the western states, kind of cool up the middle, and then warmth in the southeast. So maybe actually I can ask you guys here, and I know you have some of this in your text here, but maybe just for the wider audience here, what were you thinking here in terms of, why did you fade? Not just the actual numbers, right? But you really went with a different pattern than like what the CFS was showing for this period.
Yeah, so I think the biggest part of that was, well, there's really two reasons. The first being the GLAM, which we mentioned in our discussion, this is your global wind measure. Basically, the forecast was for it to trend negative. When you get a negative GLAM, you tend to get a negative PNA, and a negative PNA often gets you your southeast ridge. The other factor was the positive AO, your Arctic oscillation. This time of year, you get the positive AO, you do more often than not have a southeast ridge.
Yeah. It's interesting too. I mean, for folks who, sometimes we talk about that in forecasting, it's, sometimes you have to, you don't want to be stubborn to a fault, and you want to adapt with the data. And clearly this was a case where you guys really did that, and it worked out well. Your previous forecast was kind of up here with, kind of a cool southeast, but obviously you changed that for this forecast, and you changed it, and it worked out very well for you. Does anyone else have any thoughts before we switch to the forecast? Back, and this could be for Maxar, this could be for anyone. The bias, we just talked about the bias and how the bias has been, it's not just a one-time thing, right? There's been a significant bias here for several weeks, over a month, in terms of the models, but it hasn't necessarily been there all winter, in particular with the ECMWF. Does anyone have any thoughts in terms of one of either two questions, which is what's been the main driver of the bias recently? Why are the models missing, right? Why are they consistently missing it to the warmer end? Is it something to do with the MJO, tropical forcing? Is it something to do with the stratosphere? I mean, what is it? And two, and I guess this kind of gets into your forecast a little bit, but should we expect that this is a bias that's going to be reliable and steady for the foreseeable future?
So I'd like to jump in on that one. So I think one of the big factors behind the bias is just the model handling of the pattern near Alaska. We've seen that not only in the 16 to 20 day period, but even in the 1 to 15 day. Basically, as farther you go out in time, the models tend to want to build more ridging up into Alaska, and there's a reason why they want to do that. We've had a lot of storminess over the Western Pacific, and typically when you see that, you will get more of that ridge up into Alaska. So models are holding on to that idea. But also in the background, you have a very strong stratospheric polar vortex. That's helping to sustain the positive AO. The AO has been very strong since the end of December, and generally that's falling in line when we have seen the biases increase significantly. So really the past 30 days or so where we've seen those biases increasing quite a bit. Yeah, I mean, you have the MJO plot just up there. I mean, that's kind of reflective of where the storminess has been in the tropics, generally focus Indonesia towards the international dateline. So your phases 4, 5, 6 in general. So that certainly would contribute to models thinking that you'd have more ridging up into Alaska. But because you had that positive AO signal, I think the orientation of that probably influenced by the stratospheric polar vortex that's held more troughing over Alaska than where models had wanted to see, especially at longer lead times. For your second question, as far as the biases going forward, I think there's good indication that because the stratospheric polar vortex is strong, that we're going to hold on to this same positive AO pattern that we've been in since late December, at least over the next several weeks, probably into March as well. So there's certainly that potential that you'll continue to see models struggle in handling that. That said, as you go forward in time, you start losing coverage of the U.S. That would have HDDs accumulating. You start to lose the South. So with that, you may even see the biases starting to ease off a little bit, but that's more of a not necessarily a change in the bias for temperatures, but as far as what the HDD number may do going forward, because you are losing HDDs with time just because of this change in season.
All right, thank you. And with my research hat on, and for in particular some of our student members, I thought there was an interesting sort of connection that Bradley mentioned, suggesting that when you have, hopefully I'm not putting words in your mouth, but when the polar vortex is really spun up like this, the stratospheric vortex, that maybe the models sort of underestimate the AO, and which ultimately leads to sort of this cold bias, right? So this could absolutely be something that potentially we can investigate in the future, and kind of try to put some numbers to, and look at situations where again you have a polar vortex in scenario A versus scenario B, and to then evaluate the model bias associated with both situations. I think that would be a really interesting study.
Hello, how are you doing, David? This is Al at Maxar.
Hey.
Well, you make a good point. Looked into this AO persistence, and the years with the most persistence in the positive AO and a decent amplitude since January are in 89, 90, 2002, and 2017, and all of them feature a very robust positive AO going into the winter and even into the early spring. So, I mean, if you look into the past, there's definitely a point to be made about strong polar vortex that actually sustains itself into further in time here.
Hey Al, if you don't mind, since you went there, I'm old enough. I remember that winter of 89, 90, and to me, that's still one of the most incredible pattern changes I've ever seen. For folks who don't remember or haven't heard about it, it was a brutally cold December in Chicago and New York for a lot of the eastern states. I mean, it was one of the, I don't know if it still is, but one of the top coldest Decembers in the areas. And Chicago had like a ridiculously cold temperature. I think they might have got down to like -25. And then the pattern switched like almost I've never seen, and it ended up being warm in Jan Feb. Do you, you mentioned the AO connection that winter. Do you have, do you recall any other kind of details about that winter that led up to the shift from cold to warm in January and February?
I definitely recall the winter you're talking about. I was living in Rockford at the time, and on my birthday, which is December 22nd, I actually got down to -21 or -22, something of that sort, which was ridiculous. As far as other predictors for 8990 or other signals, I can't really speak to that because I haven't really looked into it. This is just as far as discussion here, I was just looking into the positive AO. But I definitely remember seasonally what you're talking about.
Yeah, I know this is a complete sidetrack, and I didn't mean to put you on the spot. By the way, I've looked into that winter a little bit, and it's never been super clear to me why. Like, it's easy. Even playing Monday morning quarterback, I don't know if I could have ever said, yeah, we're going to go from this ridiculously cold December to what happened later. In the same respects that, you have winter of 13-14 where it was cold and it didn't shift, right? Like it's not super clear to me either. But I do wonder, just what you brought up, I wonder if the AO maybe there wasn't, the EPO and things like that can sometimes obviously produce really, really good cold, but maybe without the AO connection or some of the stratospheric support, maybe there were some limiting factors there, or factors that allowed for a transition, as opposed to, thinking about winters like 9-10 and 10-11, where generally you had a negative AO that kind of held things together generally in the cold side for most of the year. But again, I completely digress here. Does anyone else? We're going to stay within. We're for the rest of the call. I promise we won't go 30 years into the past. Does anyone else have any thoughts about the attribution period, the recent forecast before we switch to the current forecast?
I just thought it was interesting that, again, we noted this week because the CFS was warmer than the EC, which is the first time in the entire winter that that's happened. And if you go back to Maxar's report, or what the CFS was predicting pattern-wise, I can't remember when it was, but I feel like there was another point in like the last 4 or 5 months where the CFS was different than what it usually is, got it correct, but based from a pattern perspective, completely missed. So I just thought that was interesting that it got the number right, but it didn't really get the pattern correct.
Right.
So how good is the CFS actually?
Exactly. No, that's a great point too. I kind of avoided that. Was this a case of just the broken clocks right twice a day, or did the CFS, even if it didn't get the pattern even close to right in the United States? I mean, at least in the eastern half of the country. I guess the Northwest did okay. We'll pull up. Where's the Maxar again here? There. Do you guys, can anyone speculate on this? Did the CFS see something that the EC didn't, or is this probably more so just dumb luck? I don't know, personally. I don't know. Sounds like we're all stumped on that. All right. Well, we can switch gears now to the forecast. We can't avoid it, right, any longer. All right. So today is what, Feb 11th. So I'm pulling up the forecast board here, guys. Everyone can kind of take a look at it. Some folks may have jumped on late. We've got some of the folks aren't on the phone call today, but Aaron and Chelsea are from Albany. There, students at Albany. Paul Roundy. Sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. Matriculated from Albany to Michigan. That's right. Sorry. And Professor Lupo and Nat Johnson, some other folks here. So at this point, again, we'll kind of go around. And again, for our student forecasters who have done this before, we'd ask maybe kind of go through your 2-minute drill, especially since we've got Maxar on the line. So Maxar sort of is your audience, but anyone can sort of play client, and you guys are the vendor, and you got to give them the spiel in a minute and a half and give them all the information that they need to know for today. So who wants to volunteer and go first?
I guess I could volunteer as tribute.
All right, that's Michael. Go ahead, Michael. And by the way, Maxar, we'll save you guys the best for last here. All right, go ahead, Michael.
Let me just get...
And if anyone needs the screen, just let me know. Otherwise, I'll just try to drive it.
All right. Hello, everyone. My forecast was for 106.8 HDDs, which is significantly warmer than the 30-year normal of 124.9 HDDs. My spread was normal confidence at 19.5. The reason for my forecast was all of the teleconnections, EPO, AO, NAO, and PNA all point to a warm pattern continuing that we've seen for these, I guess, past month now, at least. So continued warmth was the thing that I saw from that. The CPC vaguely agrees with this. It does have a little bit of areas of below normal, but those areas are mostly have really nobody living there. Like Montana and Idaho have fairly low population centers, whereas the heat that they show on the East Coast is fairly close to areas like New York and Chicago. So I did raise my forecast a little bit just to account for some of these colder areas, but 106.8 was the final answer, if you will. And that's my forecast.
Any questions for Mike? Short and sweet. Who would like to go next?
I'll go next. All right, hi everybody. My forecast for this period was 125.1 HGDs with a slightly above normal spread of 24. Changed up my formula again this week, just experimenting, seeing what works, and basically put a weighting scheme on the three different metrics that all have positive performance for this entire heating season so far. So I put 40% weight on the 30-year moving average, 40% weight on the 10-year normal, and some 20% on the MJO analog. That, using that weighting scheme, gave me a number only 0.2 HDDs above the 30-year, which puts me, I believe, at the only cold forecast human-wise. So from a pattern perspective, based on what I was looking at the models, it appears that it's going to be something similar to what we have seen, of more of a trough ridge pattern if you're moving from west to east. And I decided to bump up my sigma for a number of reasons. And although it's just a formula, it was, I thought, a little bit concerning that it popped out a number that was the only cold human forecast number. So just based on how recent verifications have been, a lot of warmth, everybody else, pretty much most people are anywhere in the range from like 20 to 30 HDDs below the 30-year normal. And it's another week where the CFS is going warmer than the 30-year. So I think there was a lot of examples here of potential warmth in the forecast that my formula may not have captured. But the metrics that I chose have been doing well, so I kept my mean the same and just bumped up my sigma to account for the potential warmth that we could see in this forecast.
Questions for Zach? Come on, someone's got to be tough on him here. All right, I will be tough on him then. All right, I'm playing jerky vendor here. Of course, that's not Maxar. No, Zach, you know, help me out here, understand, you know, you told me, or based on all the stuff that you provide us, you just told me that the bias was for the EC over the last month is 30, and yet you're telling me that you're not factoring in that in. What's changed here? Because listen, the market, I know some of the market guys are down around 105. So you're making a pretty big call here, going wherever I put you, 125. Why should I trust your number, 125, over some of the market groups and the big bias that we've seen? Is the pattern changing? Is something different?
I believe you should take my number into consideration, one, because it's factoring in metrics that have been performing quite well for this heating season, but also my formula doesn't really factor in any model forecast of any kind, so I wasn't going forward thinking about the bias in the models, just because it's tough to come up with some sort of bias corrected forecast for those models, and so I just didn't even factor those in or think about that at all.
Okay, and last follow-up, how have you performed as compared to some of these other metrics over the past 30 days? Have you consistently beat them such that, there's a data point there that, or is this sort of just a new, or how have you compared?
Well, so far, I think only last week was the only week where I did not outperform the CFS, but pretty much for the most part, I've outperformed both the CFS and the EC, but have not done better than the 30-year. So, like I said, I didn't factor any of those two metrics in, but I tried to go with a metric that would push me up above the 30-year normal, since that's what our metric is for this forecast.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
I actually have a question for Zach as well. So for your MJO analogs, I'm just curious what your methodology is for that. Are we looking at certain phases? Are we, checking out the RMM numbers and just, finding best matches and pushing them forward? Just curious what your methodology is for that.
Yeah, so I don't know if you can see the screen or not, but I basically use the MJO analog forecast metric on this page. I think it was created by Dr. Decker, and it's using historical RMM data, I believe, to come up with some sort of forecast different than the 30-year. I think that's how it works. So it's not MGO analog that I've developed on my own. It's kind of piggybacking off some work that some of the other people in the contest have done.
Yeah, I'll jump in since at least the first version of this analog, I quickly came up with, it's a very basic look at past events roughly in the same season. I can't remember exactly the plus or minus days, but find past events, whatever actually happened 16 to 20 days after those past events, average that all together, and that's the analog forecast. So it's super basic, but it's done okay.
Yeah, no, that's cool. So I mean, we have some internal tools where we do a very similar process that actually Al had developed too. So I just looking at what Al created, I certainly see a colder eastern half look from our analogs. So just kind of getting an idea of how how you're looking at the MGO. We certainly have our thoughts right now as to why that might not be a good idea, but we can certainly discuss those once we, at least for this case, when we go into our forecast details.
Yeah, and if you guys can see my screen here, this is part of the tool or algorithm or MJO analog method that Dr. Decker was describing. This, the RMM phase diagram and then the subsequent points here shows the analogs that went into today's forecast. So it's kind of a radius around the current forecast. And, it's somewhat subjective in terms of determining the size of the radius, but at least you can see how it's determined. So it takes these points, the years and the dates, and then it sort of aggregates the HDDs from all these points 16 to 20 days later, effectively. And that's, and then you have your analog forecast. So, and the other thing I just want to mention about this, one of the things we constantly try to do within the forecast contest is to mimic, replicate methods that folks use, right, that are not just simply dynamic forecast. And so this is an example, this is an initial example, but it's still an example of how a lot of folks, kind of influence their forecasts. They say, well, the MGO's in phase 5 and I expect in 2 weeks or 3 weeks it's going to be here, and that's why I went colder, or that's why I went warmer. So our goal here is to actually develop, sort of algorithms and that sort of mimic that behavior, and to see which ones provide useful information and value add skill. So that was sort of in part the motivation there.
And as Dr. Decker pointed out, because I factored it in, you can go to the heating season table so far. It's doing quite well, as Dr. Decker alluded to. Basically one of the best metrics.
See here, we'll go to
The heating season.
oh, it's the other one. I think.
Yeah.
All right, so we'll sort it, and yeah, there's your, if everyone can see my screen, MJO analog. It's it has done relatively well.
So is Dr. Decker too.
Yeah, so it's Professor Decker. As we try to plug Professor Decker here as often as we can, is I think has the highest, since we're on, we'll give him one more plug here, has the highest, I think, directional hit rate of anyone. Am I right about that? With a number of forecasts.
Yep.
Actually, and our friends in industry aren't too far behind, but Dr. Decker has a 74, since the start of the contest, a 74% hit rate. That's looking at forecast verification as benchmark to the 30-year normal, being on the right side of the 30-year normal. All right. Okay, so Dr. Decker, did you want to expand on your forecast?
Sure, I'll jump in. So my forecast is always just turn that CPC map, the 3 to 4 week forecast, into a number. So this week there's areas of both above and below normal, covering swaths of the CONUS. I figured the above normal area covers a larger population, so I did weight my forecast a bit towards the below normal HDD side, but given that implied gradient across the Rust Belt region, roughly, there's a high population, and so slight shift north or south of the cold or warm air could have a big impact. So I bumped up my sigma value correspondingly as well.
Any questions for Professor Decker, who has one of the warmest forecasts, right neck and neck there with Maxar? Paul Roundy is, too bad we don't have Paul on the line too. We could ask him about that. But any questions for Professor Decker? Great. Who would like to go next? Just me. Okay, in terms of my forecast, and then we'll turn it over to Maxar. Let's see, where am I? David. There I am. My forecast today, so, I've got this formula. I'm not sure how well it's been doing, but you can see my formula here, and I didn't really change it much. The one thing that's, customized, I guess, is my fudge factor. And I put in a -15 HDD fudge factor here. And really what that is, and I describe it here in my strategy, it's sort of a bias correction. And it's, in some ways, it's a little bit maybe analogous to some of the things that Bradley was talking about. I don't have a really hard objective method to do this. But what I tried to do is look at the 30-day bias, and I tried to go utilize the 30-day bias, or start with the 30-day bias, and then I asked myself, do I think this is representative of the current forecast? And I think the answer is yes. In other words, do I think something's changed fundamentally where the bias from the past 30 or so days is no longer represented? And I think the answer is yes, for some of the reasons that have already been described. The AO, the strat, I think some of the mechanisms, I don't know this for certain, but that I think that have gotten us here are still likely in place. So I think there's still likely, more likely than not, going to be a bias. Now, why didn't I go like whatever, minus 30 or whatever it was that the EC shows over the past 30 days? Because I also don't feel like a 30-day bias is quite long enough. And so what I really wanted to have is like a 45-day bias, but since I don't have that metric handy, I tried to estimate what, maybe more what a 45-day bias would have amounted to. And that's where I came up with something that was probably closer to the 15-day. The only other thing I'd mention is, and again, this is more of it's probably still more of a warm signal than a cold, but they're obviously talk about the MJO and how it's moving from, it's kind of in phase 5 and projected to move toward phase 6 and 7 in the next couple weeks. Again, some of what I'm about to say is subjective and it's just experiential. We obviously saw something analogous to this back in January, and of course, we never really realized a really cold transition. That's part of what goes into my thinking, but actually, I also think more in February that when you get that same kind of transition from phase 5 to 7, I think phase 7 tends to show. I don't know if I have it up right now. Maybe I do. Caitlin, yeah, Caitlin's got a good site here. A student formerly from Albany. When you're in phase 6 and even 7 to some degree, there's still a pretty strong ridging in the Southeast United States, especially into February. So, I just think I think it's going to be tough to really remove that pattern, right? So that also weighted. I didn't ignore the tropical forcing signal. I just think based on what I'm seeing right now, it's still actually more likely to be a warm indicator than a cool indicator, despite the fact that we're in phase 5 and moving toward phase 7 somewhere around this period. All right, any questions for me?
Dave, real quick, I'm sorry I had to miss the MJO composite analog tool. Can you tell me again real quick, that's a lag 0 rolled forward to the 16 to 20? Or I'm sorry, it's a 16 to 20 day lag off of the current MJO phase, just to, if I have that right.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And then we put like, and these things are somewhat arbitrary, but there's a certain radius around that, which, again, it's somewhat arbitrary. But we try to find a good sort of balance where we capture a decent subset of events, but, we're not looking at, if we're in phase 5, we're not pulling events from, phase 2, that kind of thing. But again, it is somewhat arbitrary. It would be good to do more sensitivity tests. And then we have a window around that in terms of seasonal. So I think we do, again, that's, you can adjust that, but I think most of the time I've got it set for like plus or minus 20 days or something like that. So today's what, Feb 10th or 11th. So it would look, into late January, then out toward March 1st or something like that. And it includes years since basically like the last 30 years or so, or 35 years.
Okay.
Maybe it's another discussion for another time, but lots of ideas, of course, of how to continue to build off of that, looking at progressive versus non-progressive events, maybe building in other factors such as climate signals, and so NAO, AO, things like that. So that's certainly on our wish list. So. Okay. All right, Maxar, why don't we turn it over to you guys? Would you like the screen?
Yeah. I don't think we need it just yet, but I'll let you know if we do. If you just want to bring up our forecast. While you're doing that, just more on the MJO things, I think this is interesting given that your formula has worked out to fairly well. Just wanted to note that sea surface temperatures Indonesia towards the international dateline in the tropical Pacific have been near record warm levels here over the past several weeks. And so we have seen some enhancement of storminess really all season long over that region. So it's been a struggle to progress the MJO away from phases 4 through 6. You get to phase 7, but then it kind of reverses back like we saw last month. So I think that's certainly contributing to that. So in this particular case, I would be a little bit hesitant to think that just because you do have some upper level movement in the MJO towards phases that would typically correlate to the colder side, um, that we're not necessarily a coherent signal either, because in order to get to the left side of the RMM plot into some of those historically colder phases, you'd really need to lose some of that storminess that we're seeing over the Western Pacific, and that might be a struggle to do given how warm sea surface temperatures are over that region. So as far as our forecast, a couple things that are going into it. I just wanted to mention that I think our methodology for our GWHDD number is a little bit different than maybe what most folks are doing. But basically what we do is we just draw a map, and then we allow the GWHDD number to fall out of that map. So we don't directly calculate the GWHD number. We're actually forecasting temperatures and then allowing the GWHD forecast to come out of that. So first thing that we do when looking at a 16 to 20 day forecast is to see where we are leading into the period. So we're looking at the models, their trends in the 11 to 15 day period. We want to make sure that our forecast as we get past the 11 to 15 day period makes some sense. So if there's going to be a change in the pattern or not, we want to be able to make sure that the evolution from day 15 into day 16, that makes sense. So things that we're looking at right now with the late 11 to 15 day period is we have the positive AO, we have a positive EPO, and we have a positive WPO. So basically we're looking at an upper air pattern that has ridging over the northern Pacific, a trough over Alaska, and more troughing over the Arctic Circle as well. Fairly strong signals within the model ensembles, which is important and certainly could preclude that the 16 and 20 day may hold on to some of these features as well. As far as the AO, that is one of the bigger signals that probably being maintained by the stratospheric polar vortex, whether you're looking at the vortex in terms of temperatures being cold or winds being strong. Those are certainly factors that you can look at to identify it. This particular map, we're looking at 50 millibar height departures, obviously very cold, very strong stratospheric polar vortex. So so we do have that positive AO in the 11-15 day period, and just based on the stratospheric polar vortex itself, would assume that positive AO is going to be maintained as we go forward. So when we put that together, we see how the end of the 11-15 day looks. We're generally looking at a pattern where cold air is going to be locked in over the Arctic because the positive AO winds are going to be strong enough that it's going to prevent polar air from spilling southward. We also have a flow that's more out of the Pacific into North America. That's going to be your Pacific signals, your positive EPO, your positive WPO. And so when we put all of that together, we end up with a forecast that has above normal temperatures across the eastern half. We have aboves also, well, actually, we're closer to normal in the western U.S., but not a lot of cold air to work with here. So, and then ultimately that leaves a number that's around 105 GWHDDs for the period. You know, obviously you see the models on there as well. We do think that the ECMWF model is probably best in handling the pattern over the CFS, just given that model skill 11 to 15 days out, the ECMWF has been performing better than the American models, which show a little bit more ridging into the Gulf of Alaska, which suggests you could start to lose that feature. They start to shift at least the EPO, TNH pattern being a little bit different over that region. So those are certainly things that we're fading within our forecast, just given how the Euro has performed a little bit better in that region. Also, the bias from the American models, be it the GFS ensemble or CFS, has been too much ridging into the Gulf of Alaska than what's materialized here over the really most of the season to date. So giving that consideration, we're generally closer spatially to the ECMWF weeklies model, but we are warmer in general. Part of that is just based on the pattern itself, a lot of warm indicators, but also having some consideration to the fact that models have been biased to cold.
Any questions for Bob or Bradley? Sorry. Bradley, I have a couple questions. If you know, in some late winters, springs, we have seen, even after warm winters, we have seen an abrupt change to cold, and in some cases, a surprise change to cold. What, you know, and obviously you guys aren't seeing that right now, at least, well, yeah, through March 1st. What would you look for us to end up in one of those situations where, despite the fact that most of the winter has been on the mild side, that, you know, that we could take a turn to a much more dramatic cold March or April or something like that? What is there anything that would be on your radar, or is it just one of those things where, you know, it's just hard to predict?
Yeah, so Al's got a couple of points to make on that too. I think for one, though, we're basing a lot of this on a very strong stratospheric polar vortex and maintaining that positive AO signal. As we do go forward in time, though, we're going to start to fade out that the stratospheric polar vortex just with the seasons. So it becomes less impactful as you go forward in time. Because the vortex certainly more it's stronger during the winter season than other times of year. So, but Al, I believe he said he has a couple of points he wants to make about that too.
Yeah, so the Arctic oscillation has been very positive, and you had those analog years I was talking about. The general thing that happens, there's two different ways probably to get cold air into the spring after fairly warm positive AO winter. One way would be, obviously, the most obvious would be the breakdown of the polar vortex, and you have more waviness and you know, higher wave pattern across the northern hemisphere, which can bring more troughing and more ridging to certain areas. That helps out. The second way is sometimes at the when for the positive AO to actually bring colder than normal temperatures, the eccentricity of the polar vortex actually, I think it tends more towards positive, and so, you know, it's not a circle, it turns more into an oval. If that oval is stretched into North America, you can get that cold air to come in. So there is a couple of ways to do this in the spring.
Okay. And
Yeah, and to add to that too, just a lot of the signals themselves. Spring is certainly a tricky time to forecast, just like the fall is when you are in transitional periods. So that's something too to take note of. Is, you know, some of the oceanic signals that are impactful during the winter may have very different type of impact depending on where you are in the spring. Just their correlations themselves are much weaker during the spring season too. But yeah, I just want to echo too what Al said too. You know, there's things that we're looking for this particular situation, but there's a lot that can change once you do get into the spring season.
Yeah, the two regions of convective forcing start to have a different outcome, right, seasonally. So right now, it doesn't look like we're going to change the two region setup. I mean, the CFS is probably colder than the Euro because it's more cleanly handing off convective forcing control to the Central Pacific for a while, and that just hasn't worked. The Indian Ocean and Indonesia have stayed active, destructively interfering with any of the good meridional RWDs that come off of Central Pacific action. And you know, the Euro, if you look at the Euro Weekly's 200 millibar BP hub molars, there's a pretty clear signal to maintain this two areas of convective forcing, the Central Pacific and then back in the Eastern Hemisphere as well. So I love what the Radiant guys are saying, and Maxar guys are saying now about the, you know, the kind of top-down the non-standard, top down. When we think of top down forcing, we usually think of sudden strat warming and all that jazz. But this has been a great winter example of top down coupling that keeps the tropospheric polar vortex very strong. I don't see anything that's going to change that. I mean, we threw two hellacious Central Pacific eastern propagating modes, very coherent modes, and some decent meridional arcing RWDs and a little bit of wave driving up to attack the strat PV, and it didn't blink. So I think it's going to have to, like Al was saying, take the seasonal weakening. But I think the impetus to try and get some springtime cold comes from the seasonal change in response to Eastern Hemispheric convective forcing. So, through late December, January, February, and probably much of early March, two regions of forcing means no negative EPO, really. I mean, you basically chop the negative EPO attempts off at the knees. You either undercut it or you just don't allow much wave energy dispersion to set up a wave train to favor ridging through Alaska and Northwest Canada. You shorten the wavelengths in late March into April, that might be the way to go, and probably has to come coincident with a seasonally weaker polar vortex situation.
Yeah, there have been a couple references to AO, and I know this has come up in previous weeks, but we haven't had a chance for Maxar to weigh in on this. Do you guys have a view as to why what's driven the largely positive AO here? Especially since around January, but even in early December there. And obviously the models have underestimated, but I guess the first question is why, what do you think has been the primary driver behind the positive AO? And I guess I can't leave this part out. And I don't remember exactly what your view on this is or not, but in terms of the sunspot cycle, do you believe the sunspot cycle is a player here and that it was just overwhelmed? Or are you guys of the view that the sunspot cycle and whatnot is not really a strong predictor of the AO?
All right, so first with the solar cycle, our general thinking is just looking at historically longer data sets. We don't think that the solar cycle is as big as an impact as far as influencing the high latitude pattern as much as some of the other forcings that are out there. Certainly, if we look at the past 30 years, you have a better correlation. If that probably gets a good hit after this season. But if looking back to data back to 1950 or so, the significance is much less. Our preseason forecast, we didn't have a whole lot of blocking within our forecast. We allowed the oceanic signals to have a bigger role, but we did hold the risk that because of the solar cycle and what we've seen over the recent minimum back, the 2009-2010 season, for an example. We allowed that to be a risk to the forecast. Obviously, the opposite happened. I don't have a good feel for why that happened. I think there could be some relation to the stratospheric polar vortex getting beat up earlier in the season, and the rebound was just very strong, and it's held on since then. But I can't claim to know if that's the case or not.
Thank you. I'm looking at the clock. We only have a few minutes left. Any other questions for Maxar related to the weather, the forecast, or even just some of the things that they do on a normal basis? Anyone else have anything that they just want to add to the forecast? Right.
This is a bad winter for low frequency dynamical seasonal forecasting. I got to throw that out there. I mean, I have my pet theory on why the AO is so strong, and I think the sunspot, solar activity theories should not be thrown out with the bathwater here. A lot of people in the industry are trying to take a dump on those ideas and call them more voodoo-esque, and I think there's some pretty solid physical connections behind it that make sense. I think this winter is a reminder that timing is important. So physical process timing can matter. If you beat the hell out of the polar vortex too early, and you break it apart very early on in the season, all of the decent warming events are followed necessarily by radiative cooling recovery. And if you do radiative cooling recovery right into the climatological peak of the damn strat PV, we may be learning a lesson here that you're basically, you're throwing fuel on that strong cold polar vortex fire, if you will, to use some ironic terms there. If you let it repair itself into its climo strength period, then peak period, that's a problem. So I think now people are going to overestimate the importance of AO going forward in the future and underestimate the importance of convective forcing. So maybe there's some opportunities down the road. So don't throw out the dynamics with the bathwater in a subseasonal sense, but a seasonal forecasting, look, we're not very good at this. We don't know what the hell we're doing on a seasonal basis.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point you bring up, Jason. I mean, the fact that there is a tendency, myself, I know I've done this, to fall into that short-term bias correction, so to speak. Like whatever happened last year, you kind of overemphasize, back with the winters of 09, 10 and 10, 11, it's like, okay, everything's negative AO after that. And of course that quickly went away. And then, you have the winter of 13, 14 with the EPO and so on and so forth. So yeah, I think that's a fair point too, just because it didn't go exactly as maybe how some expected, doesn't mean that it's useless or anything like that. And it also speaks to the fact that, right, there's things that maybe we just don't understand that well. I always wonder too, climate change, right? I wonder how much is climate change influencing relationships? And of course, it's hard to answer that question, and it's really hard. It would be nice to be able to look 20 years into the future to better answer that question. But I also wonder if there could be nonlinear relationships that we don't understand that well. But well, we're officially out of time now, so we just want to thank again. We had a lot of special industry guests here today. In particular, thank you to Bradley and Al, and all the students too who joined us, and we look forward to doing it again next week. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, thanks for having us. I just want to echo too what Jason was saying too. I really like hearing his voice on the other line, because he's super smart, and I've learned a lot from him over the past several years. So yeah, I agree though, we can't forget, just because something didn't work out this season doesn't mean it's not going to ever work out again. This is a very young science. We have a lot to learn, and part of this conversation that we're having today and what you guys do weekly certainly contributes to the forwarding of the science and making things, learning things as we go forward. So yeah, thanks for having us.
This must be our Valentine's Day forecast contest discussion. There's a lot of love to go around. I like that. That's a great note to leave it on. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Have a good one. Yeah, thank you.
Brad. See you. Good to hear from you guys. Talk to you later.
Bye, guys.